1849, Georgia, cotton country near Milledgeville. The sun rose heavy and pale, dragging its light over rows of cotton that looked like frost clinging to endless fields. Georgia was swollen with wealth in those years, swollen with blood beneath it. Every Saturday the courthouse square in Milledgeville filled with wagons and voices, slave auctions where men with ledgers weighed children by the pound, where mothers' cries mixed with the bray of mules, where sheriffs patted their rifles to remind the crowd that no bargain came without threat. That same commerce carved its mark on the plantations. The Ward estate lay just east of the Oconee River, a sprawl of white columns, smoke houses, and rows of cabins beaten down by seasons of use. There the rituals of terror were staged with the precision of theater. Overseers called them demonstrations. The lash cracked like a sermon. Runaways were stripped and tied to the whipping post, their backs turned into scripture of scars for all to read. A girl caught with a scrap of bread too fine for her station was fitted with an iron mask, a contraption of steel that kept her mouth caged. Children learned to be silent, not because silence saved them, but because sound was stolen from them. Among those who endured it was Caleb Morris. 26 years old, thin but strong in the wrists, with eyes that rarely looked where he was told. He was no field hand. He had been raised in the kitchens, taught to measure spice and simmer broth, to polish pewter until it gleamed like false heaven. He could chop onions until his hands wept, but his face did not. To the masters he was a fixture obedient, invisible, present only when their appetites demanded. But even invisible men are seen when it pleases their owners. One evening, during a gathering of planters, Caleb was pulled from his work. They clamped his ankles in the wooden stocks in the middle of the yard, a torch lit above him. "Sing," Nathan Ward told him as the guests leaned back in their chairs. And so Caleb sang hoarse, cracked, dry from hours over the stove. He sang while laughter rose from the veranda, while glasses clinked, while the whip handle struck the ground in rhythm. He sang because silence meant pain. He sang because refusal meant a noose. Yet each note turned to ash in his throat, and with that ash grew something cold, something sharp. The humiliation spread like smoke through the cabins. The younger children stared wide-eyed as Caleb stood with his head trapped, forced to be the night's entertainment. They saw the masters' wives fan themselves and smile. They saw the planters' sons throw scraps of bread at him as if feeding an animal. The overseer called it discipline, but the slaves called it memory. Memory is what Caleb carried back into the kitchen, back to the well, back to the silence of his tasks. He polished knives and thought of their edges. He turned the crank of the well and studied the gears, the pulleys, the way a rope could jam and a bucket could vanish. He watched the barrels fill, watched water swallow sound. He listened to how the earth itself seemed to breathe through the stone mouth of the well. And then came that dawn, the dawn when neighbors found 3 planters drowned together, tangled in the dark throat of the Ward estate's well. Nathan Ward, Elias Pike, Thomas Hollis, names that carried weight in the county, now dragged down by water and silence. Their boots pointed skyward, their coats heavy with mud, their eyes glazed as though even in death they had not expected to be touched by consequence. The whites whispered of foul air, of bad water, of curses. Some said the well had soured, that damp air had taken the men's strength and pulled them down. But in the cabins, another whisper moved like wind between cracks in the boards. The well has turned against its masters. They said it with no laughter, only a quiet trembling of hope. Because those who bent their backs in the fields knew what the whites would not admit, that nothing on a plantation happened by chance. Wells did not choose their dead. Ropes did not twist without a hand. And Caleb Morris, the cook whose voice had been mocked in the yard, the servant who turned spoons and watched shadows, had left no footprints, no confession. He had left only silence, and silence was enough to hide him. He was seen afterward in the kitchen, apron tied, stirring cornmeal for the morning's breakfast. His face carried no sign, his hands no tremor. When asked if he had heard the commotion, he said only that the water had seemed low the night before. Then he bent again to his work, as though the world had not changed. But the world had changed, because 3 planters were gone, and the well remembered. Caleb Morris was born into the kitchen smoke of the Ward estate in 1823, though the ledger called it property acquired. His mother Ruth was the cook, a woman whose hands knew the weight of cast iron as if it were bone, whose wrists bore scars from grease that leapt like fire. She carried him into the world in a cabin that smelled of smoke and sweat, cut his cord with a butcher's knife, and wrapped him in linen stolen from the big house laundry. There was no blessing spoken over him, only the low chant of an older woman who whispered words from across the sea, words Ruth half remembered from her own mother. His father was never named, but everyone knew. Nathan Ward had taken his satisfaction one summer night when Ruth was summoned late to the house. Afterward he said nothing, and for years he would pass Caleb in the yard without acknowledgement, as though the boy's dark eyes carried no reflection of his own. But the cabins knew. They saw the way Caleb's cheekbones bore the Ward line, the way his hands matched Nathan's. The knowledge sat like a coal in silence, a master's son by blood, a slave by law. From childhood, Caleb learned not the rhythm of hoes in the fields, but the secrets of water and stone. The estate's well became his refuge. He studied the creak of its pulley, the grind of rope against wood, the way a bucket could vanish into dark and return dripping with the cool breath of the earth. Older men showed him how to repair the locks on the smokehouse, how to oil hinges so they whispered instead of cried. He listened, storing every detail, every turning gear. But the lessons he never forgot were the ones written in humiliation. His sister Leah, 2 years younger, was once summoned to the big house to carry a tray. A porcelain plate slid and broke against the floor. The mistress's cry cut sharper than glass. Leah, trembling, was forced to kneel in the parlor to beg forgiveness while the guests sipped sherry. They mocked her, told her to speak louder, to bow lower. Then, with scissors meant for trimming cloth, they cut a lock of her hair. "So she remembers her mistake," the mistress said, holding the braid like a trophy. Caleb stood outside the doorway, tray in his hands, and watched his sister's tears streak down her face. That image carved itself into him deeper than any lash. He saw her humiliation not as weakness, but as theft, something stolen that could not be returned. He carried her back to the cabins that night, sat beside her on the dirt floor while she cried, and made a vow in silence. A vow that was not spoken, not even to Ruth. Ruth herself moved with a quiet that masked endurance. She cooked for the family that had enslaved her, seasoning their stews while her own children ate cornmeal gruel in the cabins. She sang to herself, when no one was near, songs with no words, only hums, rising from a throat that still remembered the voices of the dead. To Caleb, she was a mountain in a land of shifting ground. But even mountains crumble when struck too long. By the time Caleb was 20, Ruth's body was weary, her back bent from decades over the stove. The masters, in their greed, spoke of selling her to the Louisiana cane fields. It was in those days that Caleb began to see the world as a map of weaknesses. He memorized the habits of the Ward family, when Nathan rose, when Elias Pike came to visit, when Thomas Hollis drank himself senseless in the evenings. He saw the way overseers locked their ledgers, the way keys hung from belts. He noted every hour, every footstep, every gap where silence might hide him. The public humiliations grew more vicious as he aged. Once, after an accusation of stealing a scrap of ham, Caleb was tied in the stocks in the yard. Guests gathered. Nathan Ward ordered him to sing. So he sang. His voice cracked, but he sang until his throat was raw, until sweat poured from him, until the laughter of men in white coats filled the summer air. They called it discipline, but in Caleb's mind it was a brand pressed deep that burned not skin but memory. And so a decision took root, cold, deliberate. Not rage flared and was whipped away. This was something else, a decision born of watching Leah's hair fall to the ground, of hearing Ruth's name whispered in plans of sale, of tasting the dirt when his head was forced down in the stocks. He would not cry out, he would not beg, but he would not forget. Each humiliation was another stone placed upon that vow. Each injustice tightened the knot inside him. By the time whispers spread of his possible sale to the tar camps in the pines, where men coughed black until their lungs bled, Caleb no longer thought of survival as enough. He thought of balance, he thought of the well. And in the silence of the cabins, where voices dropped low and only the night heard them, he began to listen differently. He began to weave memory into design. Sunday was the only day when the ward slaves were permitted to walk beyond the estate without chains. Not far, never alone, never without suspicion. But every Sunday, the planters of Baldwin County allowed a ritual that served their own profit: the slave markets and gatherings in Milledgeville. There, in the shadow of the courthouse, where auctions split families and contracts were sealed, enslaved people were permitted to trade chickens, eggs, herbs, or handmade baskets. The whites called it a harmless concession. They did not understand that it was also a parliament, a communion, a school of whispers. Caleb moved through those markets like a man invisible. He carried jars of molasses, small packets of herbs from the ward garden, loaves of bread baked with scraps of flour stolen from the kitchen. He bartered, nodded, gave no offense. But beneath the surface of each exchange was another conversation. A phrase about the weather was a question about an overseer's schedule. A comment about crops carried news of who had been sold, who had been whipped, who had died. Among the crowd were men and women from the Pike and Hollis estates, neighbors in land and in cruelty. They recognized Caleb not only as Ward's cook, but as a man who noticed things. They trusted him, not because he boasted, but because he listened. With time, the exchanges grew sharper, more deliberate. "The river runs low this week," one man said, meaning that Nathan Ward would travel to Macon on business. "The dogs barked past midnight," a woman murmured, meaning the Hollis overseer was patrolling late and drunk. The whites believed their control absolute, but Caleb was mapping their weaknesses with every whisper. He memorized which nights Thomas Hollis drank himself into stupor, which afternoons Elias Pike rode alone along the southern fence line, which mornings Nathan Ward rose late after evenings of gambling. He carried the patterns in his head, the way he carried recipes precise, measured, waiting for the right time to serve. Back at the Ward estate, life darkened. Ruth, his mother, had grown frail, her hands trembling over the pots. Caleb caught her once clutching her side, her breath ragged. She dismissed him with a smile, but he saw the truth. Years of labor had worn her body thin. Nathan Ward, indifferent, spoke openly of selling her south. "Strong hands fetch good price in Louisiana cane," Caleb overheard him say to a guest. "Even at her age, she'll last a few years more." The words struck like iron. Louisiana cane meant death fields that swallowed men whole, sugar-boiling houses where steam seared lungs. And Ruth, who had carried Caleb and Leah through hunger, who had given her own rations to keep them alive, was to be bartered like a worn tool. For Caleb, the final blow came with his own name. He heard it spoken at the table one night, between bites of pork and sips of brandy. Nathan Ward laughed as he told Elias Pike that Caleb, though sculled, was too sly for the kitchen. Better to send him to the tar camps in the pine country, where men spent their days boiling pitch, lungs blackened, bodies scarred. "They'll burn the cunning out of him there," Ward said. The guests chuckled. Caleb kept stirring the stew. He kept his eyes lowered. But inside, a line was drawn that could not be erased. From then on, his network deepened. He spoke more often with those from neighboring estates. He asked quiet questions about locks, about the strength of certain ropes, about where the overseers kept their shtins at night. He learned how the Hollis men often carried pistols tucked carelessly in belts, how Pike's horses were left unguarded in the back stable, how Ward's guests preferred the northern path to avoid mud. Each detail was small, harmless when isolated. Together they were a blueprint. The slaves whispered of rebellion in other counties, of men who had risen with axes, of women who had fed poison to their masters. Most tales ended in fire and blood, in hangings on courthouse lawns. But those stories did not frighten Caleb. They hardened him. He did not seek chaos. He sought precision. He sought a strike that would unbalance the county, that would remind even the proudest planter that the ground beneath their boots was not solid. He began with the well. Always the well. He studied its depth, the iron crank, the rope worn with age. He experimented in silence, jamming the winch so that a bucket stuck halfway, dropping small stones to measure how long before the splash echoed back. He watched how men leaned carelessly over the lip, trusting wood and water. He saw possibility in the darkness there. At night in the cabins, Caleb kept his thoughts hidden. Leah asked him once why he stared so long at the rafters, why he hardly slept. He touched her hair, remembering the lock cut away years before. "I'm counting," he whispered. She asked what he meant, but he never answered. What he was counting was time. Time until Ruth was sold, time until he was chained for the pine camps, time until the chance arrived to balance the scales. The Ward estate bustled with the arrogance of wealth. Candles burned late in the big house, laughter spilling across the yard. Caleb moved among them unseen, carrying platters, pouring wine. Each step, each nod, each bow was performance. Inside, he was no longer the humiliated cook in stocks. He was a man sharpening silence into a blade. The decision, once cold seed, now grew roots. Not survival, not escape, but fear planted not in his own chest, but in theirs. And in the swelter of a Georgia summer, as mosquitoes buzzed over the cotton fields and the Oconee River crept low, Caleb Morris set his mind to an act that would spread whispers across Baldwin County like wildfire through dry grass. The night before it happened, Caleb walked the yard as though carrying nothing heavier than the day's weariness. He had finished scrubbing the last of the pots, left the kitchen coals glowing low, and moved toward the well with a bucket in hand. The sky was black and heavy, the stars blurred by summer haze. No one questioned him. A cook fetching water was as natural as breath. But Caleb was not fetching water. He was testing the rope one final time. The winch, worn smooth by decades of use, had been subtly altered, its teeth shaved down, its stops set in a way that only he understood. If a man leaned too far, the crank would spin loose, the rope would slip. The bucket would fall, and with it anyone who reached to save it. Once dropped, the rope jammed tight, a trap masquerading as a tool. He wound the rope carefully, listening to the groan of wood. His hands, calloused from years of kneading bread and scrubbing iron, moved with precision. When he was done, he lowered the bucket part way, letting it hang in the dark shaft like a question unanswered. Then he walked back to the cabins, silent as shadow. At dawn, the air still held the damp coolness of night. Caleb was in the yard before the rooster crowed, chopping onions for the morning's meal. The well sat quiet behind him, the bucket missing from its perch. He let his eyes linger on it for a heartbeat, then returned to his knife. It was the overseer who noticed first. He cursed, muttering that the well had swallowed its bucket again. Nathan Ward, still bleary from brandy, ordered Caleb to fetch it. Caleb shook his head politely, explained that the rope had slipped beyond reach. "Needs strong arms, master," he said, his voice even. Ward grumbled. He was joined by Elias Pike, who had ridden in before sunrise, and by Thomas Hollis, visiting for business of his own. The three men, bound by arrogance more than friendship, strode to the well. Caleb followed at a careful distance, his apron stained with the morning's work. The planters peered into the shaft, frowning at the darkness. "Damn rope," Pike spat. Ward leaned further, reaching for the winch. Caleb spoke then, soft and calm. "Heard a noise in the storehouse last night, too. Maybe the rats chewed it." His words were bait, a tug at their pride. Hollis, never willing to be outdone, leaned over as well, demanding the bucket be pulled. Caleb touched the crank as though to help. Then he stepped back. The rope spun loose, teeth slipping just as he had carved them. The bucket plunged into the dark. The planters lurched forward, their weight carrying them over the lip. A shout, a scramble of boots, then silence broken by a single splash. The well swallowed them whole, water slapping against stone. Caleb waited. He listened to the frantic thrash, the muffled shouts echoing upward. But the well was deep, the rope jammed, the winch frozen. Each man clawed against the stone, finding only moss and wetness. One called for help, voice breaking into gurgle. Another gasped curses, then nothing but the churn of water. He raised the alarm only when the silence stretched long. Running to the house, he shouted that the well had taken them, that an accident had struck. Servants rushed out. Whites from nearby farms arrived. They leaned over the edge, saw boots and hands rise, then vanish again. Ropes were thrown, poles lowered, orders barked. But it was too late. One by one, the splashing stilled. 3 planters sank beneath the surface, leaving only ripples that smoothed into calm. Caleb stood with the others, wringing his hands as though distraught. "They fell too fast," he muttered. I tried to catch them." No one questioned him. Who would suspect the cook, the quiet servant who had been humiliated only weeks before, standing in the stocks and singing while they laughed? He was background, a shadow, invisible. The overseers argued about causes. Some said foul air had risen from the depths, stealing the men's strength. Others muttered about bad water, about disease festering below. The word curse was spoken only once, hushed quickly when a woman crossed herself. But in the cabins, the whispers spread like wildfire. Children repeated the tale in sing-song, "The well has turned against its masters." Old men nodded, eyes shining with a light they had not carried in years. Women pressed their palms together, not in prayer, but in recognition. For once, the balance had shifted. For once, death had chosen the powerful, not the powerless. That night, while candles flickered in the big house over the bodies of Nathan Ward, Elias Pike, and Thomas Hollis, the slave quarters hummed with silence too heavy to be ordinary. No songs were sung, no laughter rose. Only a murmur passed from one mouth to another, that the ground had swallowed cruelty, that the well itself had risen in judgment. None spoke Caleb's name, none needed to. He moved among them as always, carrying food, tending fires. He showed no pride, no triumph. His face was the same mask it had always been. But his eyes carried something new, not relief, not escape, only the steady flame of purpose. By morning, rumors had already left the Ward estate. In the markets of Milledgeville, men spoke of 3 planters dead together, drowned in the same well as if God himself had tipped them in. Some scoffed, others shivered. And in the cabins, beneath the weight of chains, a different thought was born. If water could remember, then so could men. Caleb slept little that night. He listened to Leah's breathing, steady beside him. He thought of Ruth, frail in her bed, still marked for the cane fields. He thought of the tar camps waiting for him, black smoke rising from pine pitch. And he thought of the silence that had followed the splash, the way the water had stilled as though satisfied. He had struck once, and already the county trembled. The day after the bodies were dragged from the well, the Ward estate smelled of damp earth and pine pitch. White men rode in from miles around, rifles across their saddles, demanding explanation. Doctors bent over the drowned corpses, muttering of vapors and unhealthy water. Ministers preached that God punished arrogance, though never their own. Neighbors drew their children back from the well's shadow, as though the hole itself had grown teeth. But Caleb Morris was gone. By the time the sun set on the second day, his pallet lay empty, apron folded neatly on the floor. Some said he fled north that very night, slipping into the Oconee swamps, where cypress roots rose like blackened fingers and owls cried through the mist. Others swore they saw him walking east at dawn, calm as a man on his way to market. Dogs were sent after him, but the scent vanished among the reeds. The swamp swallowed him, as the well had swallowed his masters. Fear thickened across Baldwin County. At every supper table, men muttered about poisoned water, about servants too clever with ropes and pulleys. Overseers kept closer watch. Locks were fitted tighter, torches burned later into the night. But fear is a seed that grows where it is least wanted. Soon whispers spread beyond the Ward estate into Pike Fields, Hollis cabins, downriver to Macon. They said a cook had struck against 3 masters at once. They said the well itself had chosen sides. Among the enslaved, Caleb's name was not spoken loud. It passed in murmurs, in glances, in a single phrase repeated across counties. The well remembers. Mothers told it to their children as warning and as promise. Young men repeated it when ordered to bow lower, when fists closed around the whip. Women whispered it over cooking pots, into the ears of daughters forced to serve in the big house. The story carried weight not because it was grand, but because it was possible. In time, details blurred. Some claimed Caleb had reached the free states, guided north by hidden hands. Others believed he still moved through the swamps, appearing at night to guide runaways by lantern light. A few insisted he drowned himself after the deed, his body hidden with those he had cast down. But the truth mattered less than the memory. He had shown that silence could be weapon, that humiliation could turn into design, that even the lowliest cook could unbalance the order of an entire county. Years later, when slaves were forced to sing in the yards for their master's pleasure, some refused. When overseers demanded smiles, some let their faces remain stone. And when wells groaned deep in the summer heat, the whites of Georgia looked at them differently, remembering the day water itself seemed to rebel. Caleb Morris was never captured, never confessed, never chained again. He vanished into story, into shadow, into the marrow of those who remembered Leah kneeling in the parlor, Ruth threatened with sale, and a young man standing in the stocks forced to sing. The planters called it tragedy, the quarters called it justice, and history called it silence. But silence is not empty. It waits, it holds, it remembers.